Don't bring your kids to Grandma's, there's no space, my mom shouted, her voice cutting sharper than the winter wind rattling the old windows. Later, my dad's words landed like bricks. Go pick up your nephew from jail, it's family responsibility. I just nodded, the weight of their demands settling in my chest, heavy and silent. That night, I moved like a shadow. I changed the door code, updated the emergency contact, and double-checked the locks. The house, once a familiar refuge, became a quiet fortress under my control. By morning, chaos erupted. Their pounding fists echoed through the hall, shrill and frantic, matching the shriek of tires outside. I watched through the peephole, calm as a predator, while panic twisted their faces into masks I had never seen before. They had expected obedience. Instead, I gave them absence. I was the dependable one in the family. The quiet problem solver everyone called when something broke, when bills were late, or when trouble knocked on the door. My parents liked to call it responsibility. I eventually realized it was something closer to convenience. Growing up, my older brother was the golden child. Charismatic, reckless, forgiven before he even apologized. His son, my nephew, was following the same crooked path, collecting mistakes like trophies while the rest of us cleaned up behind him. And me? I was the backup plan. If someone needed money, they called me. If someone needed a ride at midnight, they called me. If someone landed in jail, apparently they called me too. My parents said I was the stable one. What they really meant was that I didn't argue. I nodded. I helped. I absorbed the weight that no one else wanted to carry. Over time, the pattern became painfully clear. My time wasn't mine. My home wasn't respected. Even my children were treated like inconveniences if they disrupted the family's carefully arranged priorities. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because silence, I'd learned, can be a very patient kind of power. And patience, when used correctly, has a way of changing the entire balance of a family. The signs had always been small enough to ignore. At family dinners, my kids were the ones asked to play outside for a while so the adults could sit comfortably. My brother's son, the same one now sitting in a holding cell, could knock over a glass, swear at the table, and still get a laugh from Dad. Mom would smile sweetly at me while saying things that sounded polite until you really heard them. "You're so good at handling things," she'd say, sliding another problem across the table like a plate no one else wanted. One evening, I brought my kids over after school. They were quiet, tired, clutching their backpacks. Mom barely looked at them. "Oh, you brought them," she said, her voice thin with disappointment. "The house is a little crowded today." But when my brother arrived 20 minutes later, late, loud, smelling like cigarettes, the room lit up. Finally. Dad laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. I noticed the way they avoided my eyes then. The small pause when the conversation shifted. The way responsibility always drifted toward me like smoke. By the time Dad calmly told me to pick up my nephew from jail, his tone wasn't angry. Just certain. As if my answer had already been decided. Dad didn't raise his voice when he said it. He was stirring his coffee, watching the spoons circle slowly in the cup. "Go pick up your nephew from jail," he said, like he was asking me to grab groceries. "It's family responsibility." Mom nodded without looking up from her phone. I felt the familiar pause inside me, the one where I usually sighed, grabbed my keys, and fixed whatever mess had been left behind. 4 years, that pause had always ended the same way. This time it didn't. Because only a few minutes earlier Mom had waved her hand toward my kids' backpacks by the door. "Next time don't bring them here," she'd said lightly. "There's just no space." No space. The words sat quietly in my mind while Dad talked about bail money and paperwork, already assuming I would handle it. My brother wasn't even there. He rarely was when consequences arrived. I nodded like I always did. Calm. Agreeable. Predictable. But something had shifted. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly, not as responsibility, not as love, but as expectation without respect. That night, when the house finally went quiet, I didn't argue. I simply opened my phone and began changing things. I didn't rush. Revenge that's loud usually falls apart. The quiet kind requires patience and paperwork. The house was in my name. Years earlier, when my parents' credit had slipped and the mortgage renewal became complicated, I had stepped in. My income. My signature. My responsibility. They had called me a lifesaver back then. Over time, the arrangement blurred. They treated the place like theirs, and I let it happen because arguing never seemed worth the exhaustion. But legally, nothing had changed. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the soft glow of the screen reflecting off the window. First, I logged into the home security app. The door code was something Dad had chosen years ago, my brother's birthday. I replaced it with a new 6-digit code only I knew. Next came the emergency contact list. Their numbers disappeared with 2 quiet taps. Mine stayed. Then I opened the property file I kept carefully organized. Insurance, utilities, access permissions. Everything connected to the house ran through accounts I controlled. No shouting. No confrontation. Just adjustments. Finally, I set my phone on silent and leaned back in the chair. For the first time in years, the responsibility they loved assigning to me was working in my favor. And by morning, they were going to understand exactly what that meant. Morning arrived gray and cold. I woke before the sun, the house still wrapped in that fragile silence that only exists just before everything changes. Then the pounding started. Heavy fists against the front door. Sharp, impatient. Dad's voice cut through the wood first. Why isn't the code working? A pause. The faint electronic beep of the keypad outside. Then another try. Try it again, Mom said, her voice tighter now. Beep. 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 Access denied. I stood in the hallway, barefoot on the cool floor, watching the small security screen mounted by the door. The camera showed them clearly. Dad jabbing at the keypad, Mom pacing behind him, her arms folded tight against the morning air. Their car was still running in the driveway. Another knock, louder this time. Open the door. Dad called, confusion creeping into his voice. Something's wrong with the system. I didn't answer. Not out of anger. Just clarity. Outside, Mom pulled out her phone. I watched her call me. My phone, resting on the kitchen counter, vibrated silently against the wood. They had expected the door to open automatically. Instead, they were finally standing on the same side of the boundary I'd been living with for years. The knocking didn't stop immediately. It came in waves, first loud, then uncertain, then quieter as confusion settled in. Eventually, Dad stepped back from the door. Through the camera, I watched him rub the back of his neck, the way he always did when something didn't make sense to him. Mom tried calling again. My phone buzzed once more on the counter, then went still. After a few minutes, they stopped knocking. They stood there in the driveway, talking in low voices. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the shift in their faces, the slow realization that the house they walked into whenever they wanted wasn't actually theirs. Later that afternoon, my brother finally called. His voice carried that familiar edge of irritation. What's going on with Mom and Dad? They said the door code doesn't work. For once, I didn't rush to explain or smooth things over. I changed it, I said simply. There was a long pause on the line. Mom texted later. Not angry, just confused. As if the rules of our family had quietly changed overnight. And in a way they had. Because when someone spends years being the solution to everyone else's problems, the moment they step back forces everyone else to finally face their own. The silence that followed over the next few days felt unfamiliar at first. No sudden phone calls. No late-night emergencies assigned to me like chores. Just space, something my kids had apparently never been allowed to bring into that house. I spent that weekend with them instead. We made breakfast slowly, the kitchen filled with the smell of toast and coffee. No tension. No waiting for the next demand. At some point, I realized something strange. The world hadn't collapsed because I stopped fixing everything. My nephew would still face whatever consequences waited for him. My brother would eventually have to show up and handle his own responsibilities. My parents would have to learn that support isn't something you take endlessly without respect. And me? I finally understood that being dependable doesn't mean being available for exploitation. Weeks later, Dad sent a short message. We should talk. Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. But if we do, it won't be the same conversation we've been having my entire life. Because the door still works perfectly. It just opens when I decide it does. And for the first time, the key to that decision is mine alone.